as you point out in a brilliant column in The Sun today, Douglas Murray, maybe we wouldn't have even been in this mess if it wasn't for some of the ridiculous decisions he made as Prime Minister in the 90s.
That's right. Great to be with you, Dan. And yes, John Major has piped up again. He does on a pretty regular basis these days, whenever he once again berates the British people for not following his advice in 2016. Of course, John Major was an ardent campaigner for Remain, but that question is now settled. The British electorate settled that in 2016 in a referendum, and then again last year in a general election in which Boris Johnson's Conservative Party won a much bigger majority than John Major would have ever been able to dream of achieving. But he's come up once again this week to once again berate the British people. It's an extraordinary set of things. He berates the British government, whose failures, he says, at negotiation are so terrible. And again, as you say, it has to be remembered that it was John Major's failures that meant that Britain went into Maastricht in the first place 30 years ago, which was the source of so much of this trouble. But he also spat out something really telling. He berated the British public again by saying Brexit's going to be even more brutal than expected. And, you know, we've had this, for, as I say, 4 years straight now from John Major. He's starting to resemble his old colleague, Michael Heseltine. You know, the only time we see these old Conservative Party figures is never to do anything constructive, never to help the country in a constructive way, never to give, you know, advice to the current government on trade deals and much more, but to emerge. And every time they emerge, they spit more and more venomously against the general public. And yes, I mean, I say in the piece in The Sun today that I would have thought if you had a competition among the British public, an open ballot, and said, who would you like to hear from the least? I would have thought John Major would be up there quite high, I'd have thought.
But it's interesting, actually, that you point that out about our former leaders, because we had George Osborne revealing this week that all of the former PMs had written to Boris Johnson, giving him some pretty tough advice on the test and trace scheme. And it's very different setup that we have, where our former prime ministers seem to poke and prod the current government compared to the US, where perhaps up until now with Donald Trump, we will see over the next few months. But their former presidents seem to take on much more statesman-like roles. They get involved when there's a charity cause, for example, or a natural disaster or something like that. But they don't want to involve themselves in day-to-day policy. And I actually wish, Douglas Murray, that our former prime ministers would either shut up or do something positive.
Yeah, well, I mean, America's got a wealth of statesmen to draw upon. They've got sorry, I almost said Hillary Clinton. They've got Bill Clinton. They've got George W. Bush. They've got Barack Obama, and we've got Nick Clegg. Which doesn't feel like an even race. Nick Clegg was back this week.
Let's talk about him.
Yeah, he joined John Major.
So he claimed that we will have to struggle for relevance with the new administration in Washington, D.C. And then, surprise, surprise, who was the first international leader who Joe Biden called? Oh, it was Boris Johnson.
Yeah, hearing Nick Clegg talking about struggles for relevance is always a strange thing to hear. The BBC gave Nick Clegg a platform for him to talk about struggling for relevance, and I'm sure the British public was thrilled as I was to hear back from Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg, of course, after leading the Liberal Democrats through such a tremendous decade, lost his own seat in Parliament in 2017. And since then, he's managed to contribute enormously to the well-being of Great Britain by joining Facebook. That's right, who obviously offered him more money than he could ever dream of. And since he joined Facebook, which is, of course, giving so much to the British people, he's, among other things, been said to have been involved in the efforts to silence mainstream publications such as America's oldest newspaper, the New York Post, and stop the American or any other public being able to read about political stories that Nick Clegg and Facebook don't want them to read about, specifically in this case, the issue of Joe Biden's family and the alleged corruption therein. Now, this is amazing, because now Nick Clegg is back lecturing the British people. Again, another sore loser from 2016, who you might think the British public have heard enough from. Why can't these figures either go off like Clegg appeared to have done, just to make himself very rich and be quiet, or do constructive things to help the country at what is, by any measure, an exceptionally important time in our history? You know, this is the sort of time when you could do with I don't even want to say elder statesmen, but people who might like to be seen as elder statesmen, rallying around and helping the country through not just the corona issue, but the whole issues of trade and our place in the world. You know, it's a former Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, who's one of our trade envoys in the UK. Why haven't we got any of our former Prime Ministers from the UK? It's because all of them have spent the last 4 years being sore losers about the referendum of 2016 and continuing to think that if they keep beating up the British public, at some point we're going to say, oh, I'm so sorry, we didn't realize the greatness of Nick Clegg and John Major. If we'd only realized it in 2016, we'd have voted the other way.
Indeed, you're so right. And then that brings us to a question that some Labour MPs are asking today, and it's very much connected to this issue, Douglas Murray, of whether Keir Starmer should actually have to apologise for his Brexit position before the last election. These Labour MPs, like Ian Lavery, say that in fact there's no chance Labour will ever regain power unless the party does own up and actually admit, yes, we did want to overturn the biggest democratic vote in our history. It was a big mistake and we apologise to you. But I presume you don't think Keir Starmer will do that. There's probably more chance of hell freezing over.
Yeah, I don't think there's any chance, because once Keir Starmer starts apologising for one thing, where would he stop? He's just chucked out of the Labour Party the previous Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, because it turns out that in Keir Starmer's view, Jeremy Corbyn's got some fishy views about the Jews. Well, the strange thing about that is, of course, is that until December, Keir Starmer was campaigning to make Jeremy Corbyn, the man in question, Prime Minister of this country. There's something very odd about this. And if apologies were to start coming from the new Labour leader, it's hard to see where they would end. He would have to, for instance, explain why a man he now thinks is so reprehensible he shouldn't be in the Labour Party was so glorious and brilliant in December that he should have been Prime Minister. So if Keir Starmer starts talking, it's possible we wouldn't want him to stop.
Yes, well, that is true. That is true. And just finally, Douglas, of course, it looks like there's turmoil behind the scenes at number 10 Downing Street. It's not about our coronavirus response. It's not about the damage that lockdowns are doing. It's this internal battle about whether the Vote Leave faction that currently have the most power in Boris Johnson's orbit, so Dominic Cummings and the now departing Lee Kane, whether they should have the most power behind the scenes, or whether this new bloc, which seems to be led by Boris Johnson's fiancée Carrie Simons and other folk like the new Communications Secretary Allegra Stratton, should have the most influence. This has exploded into public view. What do you make of it? And surely, at the very least, Boris Johnson needs to find a way to get this under control, because it's not a good look for the public, is it? All of these guys rowing with each other while we're in one of the biggest crises this country has ever faced.
Yeah, it's a terrible look. I'm not particularly for the spouses, girlfriends, boyfriends of politicians having roles in government. I don't like it in America. I don't like it in the UK. I don't want a role of first girlfriend or first boyfriend and factions relating to them. I don't want this horrible mixture of serious politics and sort of girlfriend-boyfriend riffs. This is far too serious a time in our country's history for that to be the case. And you're right, it looks absolutely hideous to the British public. We have not only the most serious pandemic of our lifetimes going on and the unprecedented time in which the British public are confined to their houses, but we have the whole issue of what country we are after leaving the EU. It's my view that everyone who is in the Vote Leave campaign should certainly be at the heart of this. They got us here and they should get us through it. But yes, what I dislike most most is when court politics come to this kind of prominence, because all it does is show up the meanness and pettiness of the people involved. And we as a country need to be led by better, stronger, and bigger people with a bigger vision than this. So I hope all this stops. I hope the briefings stop. I hope Team Carrie, Team Boris, all of that just stops. We don't have time for it. And even if they think we do, we don't.